Breaking news tonight on what just happened is absolutely stunning. The United States Supreme Court just issued an 8-1 emergency decision that has completely rewritten the Second Amendment battlefield in this country. When I tell you this is massive, I mean this is a seismic shift in constitutional law that's going to change everything about how gun rights cases are fought, how states enforce their restrictions, and how the federal government approaches firearm regulation. An 8-1 emergency ruling is extraordinarily rare. We're talking about near total consensus on the Supreme Court, with only a single dissenting justice, and they acted with such urgency that they bypassed the normal months-long deliberation process to deliver this decision immediately. This was not a routine case that could wait for the regular calendar. This was the Supreme Court recognizing that something so fundamentally wrong was happening, something so constitutionally dangerous that they had to intervene right now to stop it. Tonight, the Supreme Court just rewrote the Second Amendment battlefield, and the implications are going to be felt in every state, in every courthouse, and in every conversation about gun rights in America. The Department of Justice is reeling, anti-gun states are scrambling, and gun rights advocates are celebrating what might be the most significant constitutional victory in modern American history. This changes everything, and you need to understand exactly what happened, why 8 justices agreed, and what this means for the future of the Second Amendment. Stay with me because we're about to break down every critical detail of this game-changing decision. Datonen. Let's start by explaining what this case was really about, because understanding the background is essential to grasping why this ruling is so explosive. At the center of this emergency appeal was a policy, or restriction, that placed severe limitations on the ability of law-abiding citizens to exercise their Second Amendment right. The government's argument was that these restrictions were necessary for public safety, that they fell within the government's legitimate regulatory authority, and that they didn't substantially burden core Second Amendment protections. They claimed that the restrictions targeted only dangerous conduct or particularly risky items, and that law-abiding gun owners wouldn't be significantly affected. The challengers, gun rights organizations, individual citizens, and potentially some state governments argued something very different. They said the restrictions violated clearly established Second Amendment protections, that the government was using vague or overbroad language to criminalize lawful behavior, and that the policy represented exactly the kind of government overreach that the Constitution was designed to prevent. They pointed to recent Supreme Court precedents like Bruin and Heller, arguing that under those standards, the restrictions couldn't possibly survive constitutional scrutiny. The case exploded into an emergency appeal because the restrictions were being enforced immediately. People were facing criminal prosecution or severe penalties for conduct that should be constitutionally protected, and lower courts had either refused to block enforcement or had issued decisions that seemed to directly contradict binding Supreme Court precedent. This was about the fundamental limits of government power versus core Second Amendment protections, and the Supreme Court recognized that the situation demanded immediate intervention. So why did the Supreme Court decide to take this as an emergency case instead of letting it work through the normal appellate process? The answer tells you everything about how serious the constitutional violation was. Emergency decisions at the Supreme Court level are reserved for extraordinary circumstances. The court uses these powers when a constitutional right is at immediate risk of irreparable harm, when lower courts have badly misapplied or ignored Supreme Court precedent, or when national inconsistency in how constitutional rights are protected is creating real-world damage that can't wait months or years to be fixed. In this case, the Supreme Court saw all of those warning signs. They recognized that every day the restrictions remained in force, constitutional rights were being violated. People were being prosecuted, rights were being denied, and the constitutional violation was spreading and deepening. The court also saw that lower courts had either ignored or fundamentally misunderstood recent Supreme Court guidance on how to analyze Second Amendment cases. That's a huge red flag for the justices because when lower courts refuse to follow Supreme Court precedent, it undermines the entire structure of constitutional law and creates chaos across the judicial system. The Supreme Court signaled its urgency through the speed of its action, fast-tracking the case for review. issuing sharp criticism of the lower court reasoning and making it clear that this situation could not be allowed to continue. The Supreme Court stepped in because the stakes were too high to wait. Constitutional rights were being violated right now, and the court had both the authority and the responsibility to stop it immediately. Now, let's talk about why the government's argument collapsed so spectacularly that even several justices typically sympathetic to government interests couldn't support it. The government's main claim was that the restrictions were justified by public safety concerns and that they represented a reasonable exercise of regulatory authority consistent with historical tradition. But there were fatal problems with every part of that argument. First, the government couldn't demonstrate any genuine historical tradition supporting the kind of sweeping restrictions they were defending. Under the Bruin Standard, which requires gun regulations to be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation, the government needed to point to analogous laws from the founding era or the period immediately following ratification of the Second Amendment. They couldn't do it. The historical examples they cited were either irrelevant, taken wildly out of context, or actually supported the opposite conclusion. Second, the restrictions were far too broad and far too severe relative to any legitimate government interest. The government couldn't explain why such extreme measures were necessary when less restrictive alternatives existed. And third, the government's position conflicted directly with clear holdings in Bruin and Heeler, cases that established core Second Amendment principles that lower courts and government agencies are bound to follow. What makes this 8-1 vote so remarkable is that even several of the more liberal justices, who in other contexts might be inclined to defer to government regulatory judgments, found the government's argument unconvincing. This wasn't a close call where reasonable minds could differ. This was a situation where the government's case fell apart under even basic scrutiny, and 8 justices recognized it immediately. So what did the court actually say in this 8-1 emergency ruling? Let me break this down into clear, understandable points. First, the court ruled that the restrictions at issue violated the Second Amendment and that enforcement must be halted immediately. The government cannot continue prosecuting people under this policy, cannot impose penalties, and cannot use the restrictions as a basis for denying constitutional right. Second, the court reaffirmed that the Bruin historical tradition test is the controlling standard for analyzing Second Amendment cases, and it made clear that lower courts cannot evade that standard through creative interpretation or by giving excessive deference to government safety claims. Third, the court emphasized that commonly owned firearms and firearm accessories used for lawful purposes are protected by the Second Amendment, and the government cannot ban or severely restrict them simply because politicians or bureaucrats consider them dangerous. Fourth, the ruling immediately blocks similar restrictions in other jurisdictions, creating nationwide protection against this type of government overreach. The overwhelming consensus is what makes this so powerful. 8 justices agreeing means this isn't a narrow ideological split. This is the Supreme Court speaking with near unanimity about fundamental constitutional principles. The lone dissent argued that the court was moving too hastily, that emergency relief wasn't appropriate, or that the government's interests should carry more weight. But that single dissenting voice was overwhelmed by the 8-justice majority that saw the constitutional violation clearly and acted decisively to stop it. The court just reshaped the entire Second Amendment fight, establishing new standards, new protections, and new limits on government power that will govern gun rights cases for years to come. Now let's talk about the real-world impact of this decision because the changes start today and they're going to be felt nationwide. Federal agencies like the ATF must immediately stop or pause enforcement actions based on the now blocked restrictions. That means halting investigations, dropping pending cases, and ceasing any prosecutions that rely on the unconstitutional policy. States with restrictive gun laws that mirror or rely on similar reasoning to the blocked restrictions are now forced to adjust their enforcement. And many of those state laws are suddenly vulnerable to successful constitutional challenges. The impact on pending cases across the country is enormous. Dozens or potentially hundreds of cases in lower courts involving similar restrictions will now be decided in favor of gun rights plaintiffs based on this Supreme Court precedent. For gun owners, the practical effects are immediate and significant. Protections have been expanded, violations have been blocked, and the risk of criminal prosecution for conduct that should be constitutionally protected has been removed. People who were facing charges or penalties under these restrictions may now have strong grounds for dismissal or reversal of their convictions. Retailers and manufacturers who were operating under the shadow of these restrictions can now move forward with greater confidence that their lawful business activities are protected. This decision doesn't stay confined to one state or one circuit. It triggers nationwide change because it's a Supreme Court ruling that binds every court, every prosecutor, and every government official in the country. No state can claim that the ruling doesn't apply to them. No federal agency can continue enforcing policies that violate the standards the court just established. The constitutional floor for Second Amendment protections just got raised significantly, and every level of government must respect it. But of course, the fight is far from over because the backlash and resistance are already beginning. State governments and jurisdictions with the most aggressive gun control regimes are expected to resist this ruling in every way they can. They'll argue that their specific laws are slightly different and not covered by the Supreme Court's decision. They'll immediately begin drafting new legislation with different language designed to accomplish the same restrictive goals while trying to evade the court's reasoning. They'll slow-walk implementation, issue confusing guidance to law enforcement, and create procedural hurdles that make it difficult for citizens to actually exercise the rights the Supreme Court just protected. The Department of Justice's reaction is going to be intense. Expect emergency motions asking the court to reconsider or narrow the ruling. Expect public statements from the Attorney General criticizing the decision and vowing to find alternative enforcement mechanisms. So, what happens next, and where does this leave us moving forward? The immediate next step is watching how lower courts and government agencies respond to and implement this emergency ruling. Will they follow it faithfully, or will they look for ways to minimize its impact? The Supreme Court may eventually hear full oral arguments on this case or related cases, issuing a comprehensive opinion that provides even more detailed guidance and establishes clear standards that lower courts can apply consistently. Additional challenges to similar restrictions in other states and contexts are almost certainly coming because this decision has given gun rights advocates powerful new ammunition, pun intended, to challenge laws that were previously considered untouchable. States are already preparing to rewrite their gun control statutes, trying to find language that might survive under the new standards the court has established, and that's going to trigger a whole new wave of litigation in testing those revised laws. This decision also sets the tone for upcoming major Second Amendment cases that are already in the pipeline. Cases involving magazine capacity limits, assault weapon bans, carry restrictions, and age-based prohibitions are all going to be analyzed in light of this ruling, and the outcomes are likely to favor gun rights plaintiffs far more than they would have before the legal landscape has shifted dramatically, and we're entering a new era of Second Amendment jurisprudence. So, here's what I need from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think of this 8-1 emergency ruling. Are you shocked that 8 justices agreed? Does this give you hope for the future of constitutional rights? What do you think the government's next move will be? I want to hear your perspective, and make sure you like this video and subscribe to this channel because more major rulings are coming. The fight over the Second Amendment is intensifying, and you need to stay informed about every development. This story is far from over, and I'll be here bringing you every update as it happens. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next